I'm going to record. There we go. We are recording. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm really excited to have you all. We've got a really nice full house today. We have a couple hundred people signed up. We're so glad that you chose to spend your time with us this afternoon. So thank you so much. We have a couple different accessibility options available. If you would like to use closed captioning, that is available. You can select that at the bottom of the screen. You can select closed captions, and those should be available. Also, if you prefer to use the closed captioning OneCap app, that is also available. And I'll paste the URL for that in the chat because I know sometimes that's a little bit easier to use. And yeah, we're so glad to have you. We'll get started in a few minutes, and I'm going to let my colleague Magali let folks know about Spanish interpretation options. Go for it, Magali.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a nuestro seminario. Estamos muy emocionados de que todos estén aquí con nosotros este día. Tenemos interpretación simultánea en español. Y para aquellos que hablan español y están conectados con nosotros por Zoom, por computadora, echen un vistazo a la barra inferior, donde hay como un globo, y eligen interpretación, luego Spanish o español, y su audio estará en español. Si está en un teléfono o tableta, deberá tocar su pantalla, hacer clic en más, y luego buscar interpretación y elegir Spanish, y luego hacer clic en listo. Y aquí va a pasar unas imágenes que enseñan cómo se ve eso en su computadora o en su teléfono o tableta.
Thank you so much, Magali. And Magali, would you mind pasting those instructions in the chat as well and sending to all attendees? Thank you. Wonderful. All right. So we're just at 2 o'clock now. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Jorge Alvarón is the Executive Director for Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. And we're also going to be hearing from Melissa Rubio, who is the Senior Political Manager at OneAmerica. It's going to be really exciting. And just a few more housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout, please paste those in the chat. And we are going to be answering them kind of throughout the presentation. Well, I would say throughout the conversation, because I'm going to be turning off these slides soon. So please put those in the chat and we will answer them throughout. And then we'll also take time to answer some at the end. Again, via the chat, we're not going to be putting folks on camera or on microphone because we have a couple hundred attendees. So we hope y'all understand, just to kind of keep things less cluttered. And Magali, would you let folks know in Spanish about the opportunity to ask questions via chat as well? Thank you.
Yes, can you go back to the first slide?
Yes.
So, como es un seminario web y tenemos un poquito más de 100 personas aquí con nosotros, va a ver que no pueden ver su video ni nada, pero si tienen preguntas, vamos a tener tiempo para responder esas preguntas y los pueden poner en el chat. Y ahí vamos a agarrar sus preguntas y Jorge y Melissa van a tener tiempo para poder responder a los que puedan. Gracias.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Magali. All right, I'm going to throw it over to Jorge. I'm going to go off camera. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you for joining us. It's a really pleasure to do this event, and I'm particularly excited to be able to do this webinar in partnership and collaboration with our wonderful colleagues at OneAmerica. NERP and OneAmerica have been steadfast partners in this work for almost 2 decades now since the organization got started. And so we're excited to be able to join forces at this very pivotal moment for immigration policy here in the United States. Just a quick word of introduction for those of you that don't know me. My name is Jorge Barón. I'm the Executive Director at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. I started here at NIRP as a staff attorney working with people at the Immigration Detention Center back in 2006. And I've been the Executive Director of NIRP since 2008. And I'm thrilled and deeply appreciative to all of you who have joined us. And I want to introduce my fellow partner in this presentation and allow her to say a few words.
Jorge, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're getting a request from Maricela for y'all to slow down a little bit.
I knew that would happen, Maricela. Thank you for reminding me, and I will slow down. I should know better. So thank you for the reminder. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to say hello and introduce yourself.
Hey, I'll let Maricela catch up for a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Rubio, and I am the Senior Political Manager with OneAmerica. And I come to this work actually from 7 years of organizing in Chicago, Illinois. I am new to Seattle, new to Washington, and I'm so incredibly excited and proud to be a part of OneAmerica and working with Northwest Immigrant Rights Project to win what we need for our people on immigration reform, and so much more. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Maricela, for being patient with me. I will slow down. So we wanted to start before we get into the details of what's happened in the past week or so. We wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here. And I think particularly to acknowledge all the work that has led us to the details that we'll talk about later. So Melissa, I wanted to start off asking you to talk a little bit about that, about how did we get to this point? How did we get to the victories that we've seen in the past few weeks? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I agree. It's incredibly important for us to ground ourselves in not only the incredible opportunity that we have before us with a new administration and a new Congress, recognize the decades of work from community members, those of us on the ground, and celebrate, right, the struggle and all of the organizing that has happened for decades. And, you know, want to really name that people did this, right? The folks in our communities who have been most impacted, not only by attacks from the Trump administration over the last 4 years, but our incredibly unjust and inhumane immigration system that has been in place for longer than I've been alive, right? Like folks have been fighting this fight for a very, very long time. And our organizations across this country have dug our heels in and got put our bodies on the line and have done the work that we needed to do to get us to a point where, you know, we have some of the first, right, executive actions that the new administration taking being focused on immigration. So just want to honor that and say thank you to all of the folks who have been in this fight for as long as we have been, and really name that right now is not the time for us to, you know, get comfortable. We've been in this place before with the Biden and Obama administration, or Obama-Biden administration, where, you know, we had high hopes for what would come out of that administration, and we saw more crackdowns. And so for us right now is the time to continue to organize, keep the pressure on, and demand what our communities need from this new administration. And we'll get a little bit more into that soon on what we're doing at OneAmerica and what Northwest Immigrant Rights Project is doing as well to keep this movement going. So can you, Jorge, go into a little bit more detail around a little bit of the executive orders that have just come out from and over the last few weeks, or maybe it's been a week. I don't know, time is not linear anymore in this moment, but yeah, the executive orders about Biden's proposals and particularly around yeah, immigration.
Sure, Melissa, and I want to echo your comments just in terms of honoring the work that organizers that particularly Black and Indigenous people of color around the country have done to get us to a point where politically some of the changes that we're talking about are possible. We could talk about the election and we could talk about other things, but I want to really reinforce that message that all that work is what led to the possibilities that we can talk about today, and the fact that we have some new policies in place. We talked about in planning for this that it would be, we could talk for hours about this. So I hope that all of you understand that we're going to give kind of a quick overview and then get into detail on a couple of specific things. And we welcome, of course, your questions. But in terms of what the proposals have been and what the changes or the new executive orders, I want to highlight kind of two big buckets of work. So one is the proposed legislation that President Biden introduced on his first day in office, which is it's called the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. And one of the important things that we want to emphasize is that this is a proposal, right? So it's a proposed legislation, but it has not been adopted through Congress. So when we talk about the details, really important to understand that this could all change as the legislative process goes through, and it is not, for sure going into effect, and we'll talk about the work that it needs to do. But that proposal is important because it sets kind of a vision for what the Biden administration would like to see in terms of changes to immigration policy. And while, many of us may quibble with some of the details, I think many of us are very supportive of this proposal because it paints a picture that moves away from some of the earlier proposals in legislation that included kind of heavy enforcement tied to reforms that we saw as more positive. So just a very quick overview of what this proposal would do. It would create a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who are in the United States as of the 1st of January of this year. The path would be a little bit faster for people who are DACA recipients or potential DACA recipients. The outline uses the word dreamers. And we don't know all of the details yet because we haven't seen the actual language of the bill. For people who are covered by the temporary protected status program and for certain farm workers. So they would have a quicker path to citizenship because they would be eligible for green cards for lawful permanent resident status, and then after 5 years, citizenship. For people who are don't fall into those categories for undocumented, there would be a 3-year period for them to be able to get a green card. So it would be a longer path that ultimately would be around 8 years. That's a big component. That legalization program would be a significant a part of the bill. That's one of the core provisions. It would also make changes to our family-based immigration system, reducing backlogs, eliminating something that immigration lawyers know as the 3 or 10-year bars that make it more difficult for people to get green cards. It would also include a piece of legislation that's been included called the No Ban Act, which would prevent things from like what we know as the Muslim ban from being enacted in the future. We'll talk about the fact that that's been eliminated now, but this legislation would make it prevent, a future precedent from doing the same thing. And then it would promote immigrant integration. It would make changes to the employment-based immigration system. It would enact positive reforms to the asylum laws, including eliminating the one-year bar, and also expand protections for survivors of violence, like increasing the number of U visas, which is a protection for survivors of violence now that's very, very backlogged right now, long wait list right now, so it would help eliminate those. And then it would also, something that's important to us, creating a right to counsel in immigration deportation cases for certain groups of people, so children, vulnerable individuals, and others. And then it would also work to address root causes by making certain investments in Central America. So lots of changes in that bill. And there are some things that deal with border security, but for the most part, it's very focused on improving the immigration system. So that's a very quick overview of what the proposal would enact. And again, something that we are excited to see a very progressive vision of immigration in that first proposal by President Biden. So that's the first chunk, and that was a lot. Let me tell you quickly about executive actions that the president took last week, and that have already had kind of impact, because as I mentioned, the legislation is just a proposal. So the executive actions that the president took last week, again, range in a number of areas. One of the most important things is reversing and rescinding what many of us call the Muslim and African bans, which prevented, it blocked people from certain majority Muslim countries from entering the United States. So that went into effect immediately, although there's still going to be kind of the impact is ongoing, and reversing that completely will take some time, but that's already has been rescinded. President Biden also rescinded the order that President Trump had done to try to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census. He stopped border wall construction. He provided an extension of a program to support people from Liberia, protect them from deportation. And then he issued one other important thing is that he issued an executive order directing Homeland Security to work to preserve the DACA program. And we can get into more detail in a minute about that, but that's an executive order. He sent a signal about that, just re-emphasizing that he wants to preserve that program. And then directed the Department of Homeland Security to issue some new immigration enforcement priorities that had been rescinded under President Trump. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the moratorium in a minute. So that's the whole menu of things. I will finally say that we were expecting some additional set of executive actions by the president. Initially, we thought that we were the 29th, but the latest I heard today is that that's going to be delayed. We're not exactly sure why, but we think it may have to do with the fact that the nominee for Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, his nominations has been put on pause by the Senate, or has been delayed, and it won't happen until next week. So we hope that this delay is simply because of that timing. But there is an expectation that there will be additional actions taken by the president next week.
A lot. Once again, please make sure that if you have questions about any of this, you're putting them in the chat. I know that we have folks answering them now, and we'll do our best to answer all of them as well. I also want to just put an asterisk on also what wasn't included in the Biden bill, right? That was put out last week, which is no concessions for for enforcement, which is also a huge win for our movement, right? To see a day one bill that isn't focusing on more enforcement, but really focusing on the things that we as a movement have been asking Democrats to fight for in terms of immigration. So just wanted to highlight that as well. And, that's something that we have to continue being loud and, digging our heels in on. Because as we know, that's one of the most painful things for our communities right now. So Jorge, can you tell us a little bit more about the deportation moratorium and the court case that came out on DACA as well? And then thirdly, I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about what we see coming down the pipe around more executive orders. What should we be looking out for once things start moving again?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. And I'm happy to talk on those areas. And I do want to acknowledge, and I see some of the questions that have been posed, and we'll start tackling those. So please keep going with those, and we'll start tackling those soon. So on the moratorium, so as I mentioned, the president on the first day basically ordered the Department of Homeland Security to issue new guidelines on immigration enforcement. And actually later that same day, late in the evening of the 20th, so on the very first day the president was in office, they did issue a new memorandum that's a temporary policy, which did effectively two things. The first thing it said is that it was going to pause most deportations, not all deportations, but most deportations for a period of 100 days while this review of the enforcement policies was conducted. And then the second thing it did is it said, in the meantime, we are going to issue these temporary guidelines of the people who should be arrested, who should be detained. And it narrowed that group down significantly, certainly from the way that President Trump had been conducted, which had been like no priorities, but even from some of the guidelines that were issued under the Obama and Biden years. So we saw that as Melissa mentioned, as another victory, that the enforcement was being narrowed down even further. Unfortunately, the setback that we've had in the last few days has been that the day after this was issued, the state of Texas and their Attorney General, Ken Paxton, filed a lawsuit in Texas to block the deportation pause, the moratorium on deportations. And a federal court in Texas issued what's known as a temporary restraining order, which is a temporary, order telling the Biden administration that they cannot put the moratorium of deportations into effect. Which, to be honest, it's a very weird situation on to basically tell the federal government you have to continue deporting people. It has been, long understood that the federal government has discretion on whether to actually move forward with deporting people. And in this case, the court is saying, like, you can't stop. And so we think that decision is wrong on the law. And we expect that it will be appealed. But it has left a little bit of confusion as to whether to what extent that deportation pause is in effect. Because from our perspective, the federal government should still have the power to, on a case-by-case basis, decide we're not going to deport this particular person. And we think that should still happen, and people should advocate for that. But in terms of a blanket policy, that is a little bit more in question right now, and we'll have to see how that plays out. And Melissa, you mentioned about DACA. So with DACA, the situation is also a little bit up in air, because with DACA, we have a situation where The program is currently in effect, and the President Biden is supportive of continuing that program, and also of having administration continue it. But there is this case, another case out of Texas, also filed by the state of Texas. You start seeing a pattern here, that is challenging the legality of the DACA program. And we are anticipating a court decision from that court that could, we're not sure if that's going to happen, but could, because this judge has previously ruled in ways that give us concern, that could put at risk the DACA program. And I emphasize the could part. Doesn't necessarily mean the program right now is in effect, but there is a threat out there that we're concerned about. I will say that we feel better in that at least this time we have an administration that is defending the program and wants to preserve it, whereas before we had an administration that was trying to undermine the program. So we are in a better place today, but I did want to emphasize that that remains a concern for us.
Great. And then what should we be expecting in terms of further actions from the administration?
Yeah, so there's a number of other things, and I one of the things that I neglected to mention earlier when I was listing the executive actions was the situation at the southern border with the program that many people refer to as Remain in Mexico, that the Trump administration called the MPP program they called it Migration Protection Program, although it did anything but protect people. And so the Biden administration, the president made it clear that that program is not going to continue. So they're not putting new people into the program going forward. But there hasn't been guidance yet. And so this is one of the things that we're still expecting is some clear directive as to how the asylum seekers that many of them are waiting and have been prevented from being able to apply for asylum are going to be able to get processed including the many people who have been put into this program and have been prevented from accessing asylum. So for us, that's a big question of how that's going to happen. There's also the expectation was that some of the actions that the president was going to announce, we thought initially tomorrow, we're going to focus on family separation and the how to make sure that the families who were separated during the Trump administration will be reunified, or what relief will be available to them. Also actions on the public charge regulation that the Trump administration passed, which had a hugely negative impact on communities, and we could talk a lot about that. And then also about the refugee program, because as all of you know, the Trump administration severely attacked and undermined and essentially eviscerated or really undermined the refugee program. And so that's another set of areas where we are waiting to see what the administration will do. Melissa, I see that there's a lot of questions, but I want us to see if maybe we can talk a little bit about things that people can do, or I'm looking at some of the questions to try to see if we can answer. I did see one question that I do want to emphasize here, which is that the question about local officials, about ICE, and how can we ensure this? And I think this is one of those areas where community members can help us, because we share this concern about the ICE and Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol actions. I often tell people it's the same people who are working under Trump who are going to be on the ground implementing these policies. And so just from the past experience of, previously during the Obama years, we saw that we would hear from DC that they were changing policy, but then the folks on the ground from ICE and Border Patrol were doing the same thing that they had been doing. And so we do want people to be on the lookout for these kind of situations and to share information. Both OneAmerica and NERP are part of WISN, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, which has developed as an incredible resource. There is a hotline to report, ICE and CBP activity, among other things. And so we do want people to be letting us know what they're seeing, because I think that is one of the roles that we can play, is to make sure that we are holding the administration accountable, that it's not just about the rhetoric and the words, but of actually making changes happen on the ground. Because I think that was one of the lessons that we learned from 2009, 2010 in particular, was that there was a big disconnect on what was being said by the Obama administration to what was happening on the ground level. So, so Melissa, let me turn it back to you and to talk a little bit about what other ways there are to take action, and then maybe we can tackle some of the questions that people have posed.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's obviously a ton of ways for folks to take action. I think at the base level, we all need to take responsibility for contacting our congresspeople and contacting our senators here in Washington, and letting them know that we expect them to be bold on immigration in this new Congress and in this new administration. So at the base level, making that call, sending emails, right, applying the pressure on the folks that represent you is going to be really, really key. And for us at OneAmerica, we are a part of a national network called FIRM, and we are doing, right now, we're pushing for two key things, and I mentioned this in the chat. The first thing is we are asking our congresspeople and our senators our congresspeople to sign on to Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal's Roadmap to Freedom, which is a resolution that was built with us and other grassroots immigrant rights organizations across the country, that lays out our North Star for what we expect out of this new Congress and the new administration around key pieces, or all of the key pieces of immigration reform. Because as Jorge said in the beginning of this, we know that the Biden bill is just a proposal. And we also are really clear that we have a very slim majority right now in the Senate, and a big whole package of comprehensive immigration reform is probably not going to pass in whole, right? So we really have to lay out what is our vision, and what do we expect from any legislation that comes into the House, into the Senate around these the key pieces of our platform. So we really want to ask people to sign on to that, to show that they're in support of this basically North Star. And then we're also working to take the moment that we're in, right? And we're in a global pandemic. And as we know, we've almost been in this for a year. And as we know, and as we've said on, ad nauseum, the people who have been impacted the most by this pandemic are people of color, immigrants, poor people, right? And the folks who are on the front lines of this fight are not just doctors and nurses, right? They're on the front lines, but there's also the food industry workers, right? Folks who are picking the food on the farms, packaging it, working at the grocery stores, folks who are in the medical field, who work in roles in the healthcare field, right? Like, we immigrants are doing the work that is most at risk right now. So what we're also asking our Congress people to do is to grant citizenship to undocumented and essential workers now, because you cannot say that essential workers are both essential and disposable and deportable. We cannot, that does not make sense, right? So we're taking this moment to say, grant these folks with citizenship and put us on a path to get those 11 million people in this country who've been fighting for citizenship, the citizenship that they deserve. So those are the two things that we at OneAmerica are fighting very hard to, demand of our Washington delegation and our Washington senators to take action on. And we will be sending that message every single Monday. We're going to be foaming into Washington Congress people's districts and talking to their constituents and getting them to call, because we're already hearing from some members of our Washington delegation, our Washington Congress people, that they don't want to sign on to this bill, that they're just waiting to see what comes out of the administration. And we don't want them to just be waiting, right? We need them to show now that they're serious about making change. And they've also told us we need to hear from our constituents. So we are going to be sending that message every single Monday at phone banks, and somebody will be popping the link for those phone banks if you want to join us. And that's what we're doing. I'll kick it back to you, Jorge.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. So, you may have mentioned this earlier, Melissa, but on the Roadmap to Freedom resolution, because somebody just posted that Magali just posted that on the chat. As I understand it right now, of our local reps, we've only had Representative Jayapal and Representative Smith sign on. Is that right? And so if folks who live, we want them to push on for folks who are outside those districts, right?
Yes, and thank you for asking that. And, I think one of our key pieces in this is really pushing Congresswoman Del Bene on this, because she is a leader in the House and is now the chair of the New Democratic Caucus. We really need to push her to see that it's important that she signs on to the roadmap and starts moving some of her colleagues around this as well. So if you're in Representative Del Bene, or Congresswoman Del Bene's district, please send the message. That's important.
And I just wanted to add, a lot of folks, and I've seen some of the comments on the chat about, is it realistic that we're going to get this bill through? And so, as Melissa mentioned, like, we're cognizant of the challenges, right, particularly with the Senate. But it's important as a goal, right, like a vision, and to try to achieve pieces of that over the next year. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, and this is one of the responses that I give to people who say, hey, I live in Representative Jayapal's district, like, she's supportive of this, like, do I really, is it help to call, what else is there? And I would also emphasize some of the budget issues, right? So as we move on some of these policy fronts, there's also work to be done on making sure that that funding for some of these agencies that cause a lot of harm is not, continuing to escalate as it has been for many years. So right now, for example, in issues of immigration detention, we have a situation where, for reasons of the pandemic and for reasons of the Trump administration's policies blocking asylum seekers, we actually have a relatively low, and I would say relatively being the key word in that statement, number of people detained in immigration detention compared to the Trump years and the Biden and the Obama Biden years. So right now we have a little over 14,000 people nationally in immigration detention, and around 250 people in the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. And that is the lowest that I have seen in my time working in this issue in the last 15 years or so. And yet Congress just in December passed legislation that approved funding for ICE to detain 34,000 people, right? Now that was because there was a Republican, Senate at the time. But I think one of the things that we should be driving to is to tell our representatives and people like Senator Murray, who's got a very key role because she's on the Appropriations Committee, that should not happen again. We should, under a Biden administration, we should not be seen. I mean, we want to drive to a place where there's no immigration detention. So the numbers that we have now should be a ceiling. We should never return to the numbers that we saw in the Obama years. And part of that is not giving ICE money to do so, because they will do it. Back to one of the points that people asked, right? Like, and so if they don't have space, they will not. If they don't have the money to detain people, they won't be able to do it. And so the funding piece is really important, and that is one area where we can absolutely push our both our representatives and our senators, who play a very important role, and particularly our two senators, and I would say particularly Senator Murray, to emphasize that that is a priority for you, that a budget is our values. And if we have been spending so much money on immigration enforcement and other activities that hurt immigrant communities, and this is the time to go down. So, right. And one of the questions asked, there's 14,000 immigration detention, but funding is 34,000. That's right. that is what we have right now, is that there is funding allocated. So ICE has money to detain even more people than they're detaining right now. And it should be absolutely the opposite. We should be driving down the numbers instead of giving them even more money than they're actually using right now. So that's an important message. All right. I've seen a few questions that ask about children issues. And so I did want to just address that, because I know a few of you have asked about this. So this is part of what we hope that the administration, again, that they were going to announce this task force on family separation issues. And so that is one part of what we're expecting at this point, probably next week, that there will be a task force that will be focused on addressing these issues. I do want to explain that some of the children that have been that have been reported in the news that were separated from their families, some of those children were placed with other relatives who are living throughout the country, including here in Washington. We've ended up working with some of those children. Our colleagues at KIND, Kids in Need of Defense here locally, working with some of those children. I think the challenge has been that there's been children who have been placed with relatives who have been or who have remained in the custody of the shelters run by the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, that have not been able to be reunified with the children. And I think that's the 600 number that people have referenced. And so that is part of what we expect the administration is going to tackle, is how do we ensure that children are reunified, but that it's done. And I think this is one of the call from advocates, in a way that is not placing either the children or parents in additional harm. And so the Trump administration was not trying to do that, and was fighting very hard against the folks, particularly our colleagues at the ACLU, who are at the national level, and many other colleagues who've been working on this issue. But that is what we're expecting the administration to lay out in the coming days, is how they're going to plan to address that situation and redress the deeply harmful effect that egregious abuse of policy had on so many people. So that is what is happening on that front.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. Part of our work right now is continuing to beat the drum and make it really a moral crisis, right? Or a moral decision, right? We we cannot have an administration just talk about how awful it is to have kids in cages or how awful it is that children are being separated from their families through this process. We actually have to push them to take action on it. And so, you know, we can't just take the rhetoric of that. We have to really move people, or move our Congress people, move our senators, and move the administration as a whole to take real action on it in the next 100 days in particular.
Thank you. I just looking at a few other questions that were posted in the chat. There's been a few questions about private detention and private detention centers, including a reference to the bill here in the state. So just a quick note on that. We are absolutely in support of eliminating private companies from immigration detention. I will say that we're in favor of eliminating immigration detention. So if, you know, it doesn't help us necessarily if ICE is running those detention centers themselves, but we think private companies make the situation even worse. And so a few folks, I think, have asked about whether the current, there was news this week of the president announcing a phase out of private companies for providing services for the Department of Justice, for the Bureau of Prisons, that and other parts of the Department of Justice. That order that the president issued, which mirrors something that the Obama administration did at the very end of its term, does not impact immigration detention. So that is not phasing out private companies from immigration detention. We want that to happen. So that is another area that, as Melissa mentioned, keeping the pressure up on the administration, including through our Congress members, is important to send. In the meantime, as we push the federal administration, there is this effort locally through a bill at the state legislature to closing, putting the pressure on, to actually prohibit and phase out over time private companies from running immigration detention centers here in the Washington state. And I know, and I've seen some of the questions that have been posed about the concerns that what that does, whether that could mean that people would just be sent other places. And we share that concern, but we see this as part of a broader strategy, right? So if the strategy was only to eliminate private detention centers in Washington state, then I could understand that concern. But this is part of a coordinated strategy to put pressure on the administration, particularly now that we have a Biden administration, to eliminate private immigration detention centers. So, so that does not happen. And we also think that what we see in other places is that, again, if we're driving to reduce funding, it will force, you know, ICE to not detain as many people, right? So even if, you know, we might end up seeing some people being sent to other states. That happens even now, I will say. But we think that it will ultimately reduce the number of people who reside in Washington who will end up in immigration detention. So that is why we support the state bill. And again, because we are working with organizations around the country, all of us are working in this coordinated effort to push back on many fronts to reduce private immigration detention centers.
One thing that I saw in the chat, and I'm not sure it got answered yet, but I think is important is, you know, there's a backlog of, what was the question? Have you heard anything about speeding up the backlog of, oh goodness. Asylum, thank you, asylum application.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, so that's actually something that the Biden, that what we're anticipating as part of the second round of announcements is changes to the asylum process. I will say that there is a there's a huge backlog on many fronts, right? So there is asylum backlog, there is family visa backlogs, there is U visa backlogs, immigration court backlogs. If I didn't mention that already, there's like 600,000 cases in the immigration courts right now. If you're in Seattle, if you're facing just locally, to give you an example, when our attorneys or start working with a client right now, it is not uncommon that they're getting dates set out to 2023 right now. And frankly, there's been a lot of hearings canceled over the last few months, and we fully anticipate that those hearings would not happen until like 2024 now. And so many aspects of the immigration debate, the immigration system are backlogged like this. And so, yes, there isn't anything that has been implemented that would change that, but that is absolutely one of the asks that we are making. The president, the bill, the U.S. Citizenship Act, does talk about making some changes and providing additional funding to speed up the process. For example, in terms of asylum, it would provide additional, it would eliminate well, not eliminate, but reduce the backlog in family visas. So that's some of the things that can be done through legislation or through the budget. On things like the immigration court, part of what we would like to see is the administration just dismissing cases that are not priorities anymore, and or give the power to ICE to agree to grant people protection. So part of the challenge in immigration court is that part of the reason there's a backlog is because, particularly under the Trump administration, they were fighting everything, and there's a way that the ICE could just say, you know what, we agree, this person meets the criteria, we're not going to fight this case, we'll just agree they get asylum. They have the power to do that, but they won't use it. And so you could significantly reduce some of those backlogs by directives from the administration. And so there is a possibility of those changes, but again, that's where we're going to need everybody's pressure. And I think that's part of the message that we're sending to all of you. I think that, and I think Melissa made this point earlier too, that I think many people who've been working on this have been thinking, oh, the Trump administration is over, we can breathe a sigh of relief and everything will be fixed now. And unfortunately, that is not how it works. And in that the Biden administration has a lot of, they may have good intentions, right? But they need the political pressure to make this a priority, because as all of us know, there's a lot of challenges that the administration is facing: COVID, the economy, we could go on, climate crisis. And so, like any of us, the bandwidth of like, what do I put my energy on can be dissipated, and they might put something on the back burner, which is having bad impact. So part of the message that we're sending to all of you is, please do not lose your energy. This is actually a time to double down, because we actually have the potential to make some profound change. Under Trump, like, they weren't going to listen to our side of the issue. Now we have an administration that is willing to listen, that could act positively. We just need to keep the pressure up. So that's an important message.
Absolutely. Put a lot of energy into defending our communities and, pushing back against really awful stuff. We have to put even more energy into winning what we know that our communities deserve.
So I'm going to keep looking at the questions and see if there's others. I think the other question I saw that I thought was intriguing was about whether folks thought that, like, the money that's being shifted from ICE should go to, like, the task force or something else. I would say that, the amount of money that ICE and CBP use is so staggering that you could probably fund all kinds of reforms, and all kinds of things that would be much more supportive. I'm not going to even start listing that, because we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that we could shift into things that I think are much more important. So I wouldn't only focus on the task force. I think that certainly should get the funding to make sure that the work is done to reunify those families, but there's a lot of other needs in the community as well. And I think to us, the important thing is just to see that money be focused not on, harming people and splitting up families, but instead to providing all the needs that the communities that we serve have.
Jorge, would it be helpful for me to prompt some of the questions that were further back in the chat? This is Rebecca, everyone, the voice from the sky.
Yes, Rebecca, that would be helpful because I can't always go back to the, you guys have so many great questions. So if you see something that we've missed, please go ahead.
Definitely. There was a good one recently from Tanya about, can we talk a little bit about why detention is at an all-time low? Is it because folks have been deported? Is it because folks aren't being let in? Does COVID-19 have anything to do with it? Yeah.
That's a great question. So, so it is one of those situations where I think in some ways bad things have led to a somewhat good result in some ways, but not really, as I'll explain. So there's kind of three things that have led to that. So one is the Trump administration's asylum policies. So because they have blocked asylum seekers from coming in, we haven't seen people in the interior of the US who, what was happening before would be that they would present themselves at the border, seek asylum, and they would be detained, which is not good. We didn't want those people detained. We wanted them to be able to make their case in court without being detained. But that's what was happening before. So in Tacoma, we would see a lot of people detained in Tacoma who were from the southern border. And the last few months, we have seen very few of those because the administration has just completely blocked it. So the people are just waiting to make their case in Mexico. So that's one reason. Second reason is because there has been a reduction in arrests inside the US, in our region and throughout the country by ICE because of the pandemic. They've scaled back some of the operations, similar to how many agencies and entities have scaled back, which is, of course, in this case, a good thing that they've scaled back. And so that has reduced those numbers. And then the third reason is that there has been a lot of litigation and a lot of advocacy to get people released from immigration detention because of COVID and to try to reduce and mitigate. And so this was not done because ICE wanted to do it. They didn't do it nicely. There has been many lawsuits. NERP has 2 lawsuits right now against ICE here locally, or has had 2 lawsuits. There's a national lawsuit out of California that has required ICE to release people. And so that has led to a number of people who might have otherwise remained in detention to continue. Now, there's still too many people that are at risk in immigration detention. I do want to emphasize that. But the combination of all 3 of those things in particular has been the reason that we've ended up with lower numbers of people in detention than we had, a year or 2 ago. But again, I want to emphasize there were periods of time in our history where 14,000 across the country would have seemed like a ton of people in immigration detention or very high numbers of detention. It's just that it's been so high in the last few years that now 14,000 seems like a low number, but it's far too high, right? I do want to make that point. So I don't want us to say, oh, it's great, 14,000 is low. 14,000 is 14,000 too high, in my opinion. And so that is not the goal. But what we don't want to do is to go back and end up in the numbers that we saw in the Obama and Trump years of 30,000, and then in the Trump years as high as like 53,000, I think, somewhere around that of people in immigration detention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jorge. I had some really great questions, Melissa. I think maybe you might have some thoughts on these about different ways to take action. Some folks are talking about how, we are in a bit of a waiting pattern to see about these bills, the New Way Forward, comprehensive immigration reform. Are there other actions that folks can take if they are already going to be contacting their reps, if they're already going to be applying pressure in that way?
So other ways folks can help outside of contacting their Congress people. Is that the
Yes.
question? Sorry.
Yes. Sorry, Melissa. Yes.
No, that's okay. So yeah, I think, we as individuals can certainly take and should certainly take the time to contact your Congress people individually, but then one of the most effective ways us to spread that is by contacting others that we know and asking them to do the same thing. So make a list of 5 or 10 people, neighbors, friends, family. You could probably make a bigger list than that. And ask them to take that action as well. If they agree that with our values, right? If they agree that we really need to make bold changes to our immigration system, invite them in to take the action as well. That's number one. And number two, I'm going to go ahead and plug my phone banks again because I believe they're very important. So we will be, for the next month, we are going to be hosting virtual phone banks into both Del Benny's district, but also other congressional members' districts, talking to their constituents about the issue and forwarding them to the Congress People's Office to leave a message and say, hey, I want you to support the Roadmap to Freedom and comprehensive immigration reform. So that's the other thing, right? Joining us to reach out to people who might not know how to take action and getting them to do so. And then, I think the last thing that's really important is I'm sure all of us have some sort of social media platform, but follow Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, follow OneAmerica and on those platforms and look for ways that you can amplify what we're doing on social media as well. If you are not a fan of talking to people like I am, you can do that as the very least, right? Retweet what we're tweeting, tweet at your representatives and amplify the actions that we're taking so that the message is loud and clear in every way that we can be communicating it. I hope that is a good answer. If not, please figure out or put in the chat follow-up questions.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Melissa. That's great. We do have a couple questions that are more around backlogs and what can people do. So there were 2 questions about the Muslim ban specifically and the executive order rescinding that. And just wondering if that's going to mean that folks' cases are going to be reopened, that folks that weren't allowed to travel here but might have been approved for resettlement. How is that going to affect folks that were kind of put in limbo by that executive order and now the reversal of it?
Yeah, Rebecca, those are great questions. And so unfortunately, it's going to take some time. And the president in the proclamation, the executive order that he issued last week, he rescinded the Muslim ban and then basically directed the State Department to do a report and to start the process of reopening. And there's a report that the Secretary of State will have to issue within 45 days. So pretty, relatively quickly by government standards on how to initiate the processing of those cases. I think it will take some time simply because because of the pandemic, there's also been kind of a slowdown in many countries of the regular consular processing process. And so it's not entirely clear to us how quickly that will happen. But the important thing is that there has been, a reversal of policy. And so we do hope that many of those people who are impacted will be able to try again, but it may take them some time to do so. I think there will still be some people who, unfortunately, there's probably people who will lose opportunities because of age out situations. That part is not entirely clear yet, but there will be further guidance that the Secretary of State and the State Department will have to issue on those cases.
Yeah, that makes sense, Jorge. And, one question kind of for both of y'all, are you thinking about how, one question we had was around backlogs. It was because of the previous administration redirecting efforts to enforcement. Do we think that the Biden administration, or is one of the asks of the movement, that Biden redirect resources to, processing applications, to moving people to closer to the forms of immigration relief that they might qualify for, rather than putting those resources towards enforcement?
Well, Melissa, I see you nodding. I'll start and feel free to chime in on this. But I think the answer is partly yes, partly about resources, but it also is about, changing the actual sort of policies, because I don't want to say that it was simply, the fact that we've been providing so much funding to ICE or CBP that was causing the problems. It's also about the policies. There are certainly some people who are in this, long backlog of cases. And so for those folks, making changes is important, but some of those changes can only happen through legislation. So I think I would also emphasize that. So issues like the family visa backlog, the U visa backlog, are just part of, require Congress to approve more visas for those people. And so the president can expedite certain processes, but some changes need to happen by Congress. And then there are people, I think it's also important to say, and this is why the bill is so important, that don't have a pathway right now, right? And so they can't be on a backlog because they don't have a pathway to be able to legalize their status. And that is, I would say, at least a majority of the people who are undocumented in the state of Washington right now. And so, so I don't want to, while eliminating those backlogs are important, I don't want to only focus the energy there, because that would still leave a large segment of the community out. And so, unfortunately, this is one of the situations where you need to do both, right? I think we need to be working on all fronts. And Melissa, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I just agree. It's a both and situation, right? Unfortunately, we have a lot of work to do in this area, and we should be, actively asking for everything that we need to see change and move.
Wonderful. So most of the other questions that we haven't gotten to were maybe around more like legal specific forms and types of questions. And I feel like this might not be the right time in the flow of this presentation to go back to those things. So, we have about 9 more minutes, and I'm wondering, Jorge, Melissa, if there are any sort of like final words of wisdom that y'all might want to share with the folks who are still on the call. And I also just want to let everyone know that we are going to be sending links to ways to take action, to the resources that have been mentioned in the chat afterwards. So expect those in an email from us. So don't worry if you didn't take notes.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. So one thing that I had wanted to mention earlier is that many of you who are working as community members need to be alert to the potential for abuse of community members at a time like this. We have already heard of situations where, either people who are attorneys but are trying to take advantage of people, or what we often refer to as notarios, people who are trying to help, to take advantage of an uncertain situation, start advertising, start telling people, pay me some money and I'll help you put together an application for the quote unquote Biden amnesty. Like, we have already heard reports of that kind of situation happening. And so, and of course, people hear in the news that there is a new proposal, and so they think this is true, and they're very eager and have been waiting for many years, and so they end up, falling prey to these kind of scams. And so, please be on the lookout for that. Please, that's another thing that people can do, is to make sure that they're passing good information. It's a tricky balance, I think, that we're trying to strike, because I think we do want people to have enthusiasm and to have energy and to be excited about the possibilities for reform. But we also need to be cautious that people also understand like what is possible right at this moment. I think I actually saw a question earlier that said, like, what can people do? Like, people directly impacted community members who might benefit from some of these proposals. I always tell people, stay informed, from good, reliable sources, because things change, right? I mean, what we're telling you today might change next week or 2 weeks or, a month from now. So keep up to date. Folks in the community who might qualify for a legalization program, should always be keeping evidence, paperwork that they have, that, I always tell people, if it has your name and a date, hold on to it. Now, don't turn it to other people, just save it somewhere, because it might be something that might help you in the future. Maybe not, but, it's good to save it. And so that's really important. And so we do need people in the community to be able to send that message, to help us spread that word and continue to spread good information, because there's oftentimes a lot of scams, a lot of abuse, and a lot of uncertainty, and we don't want people in the community to end up being victimized. And we've seen it before, and it's heartbreaking when you see those kind of situations. So that's an important message that I wanted to send. And then, just reinforcing what I said earlier about staying engaged, right? And I appreciated Melissa's talking about following our social media channels. There will be moments in the coming months when there will be a point, an action point, and different bills, and a moment when we need a surge of calls or contacts. And so for all of you to be ready for those moments is really important. And of course, I would not be doing my job if I didn't say that all of this work and all this coordination takes resources. And so, supporting financially to the extent that you're able to do so, our colleagues at OneAmerica, as well as our organization, is incredibly important, because being able to do the advocacy and do the legal support for people in the community is only possible because of amazing people like those of you on this webinar, and many others who weren't able to join us. So that is an important component, helping others in the community know about the importance of this work, serving as ambassadors. Most of you on this call are already know the issues very well and understand it well, and understand, that's why you joined today, is because you know as well. But, most of the time, how people learn about these issues, this work, is through word of mouth, right? And somebody else telling them, like, this is really important, and it's particularly important right now. So helping us in that role of ambassadors for us is incredibly important. So I think both of our organizations would deeply appreciate that kind of support. And I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't stress enough how important it is in this moment that we keep our foot on the gas and keep putting our Congress people's and senators' feet to the fire when it comes to their action around immigration. So, we have to make our demands at the center of what anybody wants to think about doing in the next 100 days in terms of immigration. And I believe that we will win if this movement continues to put that pressure on and demand what us and our family members and, the millions of people in this country who have been fighting for their dignity and respect really deserve. So thank you all for being here, and I look forward to fighting with y'all in the virtual streets.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jorge and Melissa. It was a real pleasure to hear both of your expertise on this. Thanks so much for spending this time with us.